Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program created in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features John Sperzel, the chairman and CEO of T2 Biosystems.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I have 9:01. We'll get going. My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled you're here to join us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. And as I've said, actually, this will be the last time I say this. Coming up next Monday, September 27th, we have our NewYorkBIO annual meeting. So by next Tuesday morning, we'll be done. I'll be able to do a day in review. But we really hope you'll join us next week. We have just a few spots left for in-person attendance because we're obviously limiting in-person attendance in order to hopefully maintain a little more COVID safe space for everybody. Vaccines are required. We hope you'll join us for those few last spots, or we do have a virtual option. All the info is on our website. So go there, find out all the info, and please register to join us. Thank you to Woodruff Sawyer, who is our partner for this month of virtual breakfast series. We very much appreciate that partnership and the work that they allow us to do to have amazing guests like John on the program. Before I turn it over to Derek, my usual housekeeping reminders for everyone. Please ask your questions throughout our conversation with John and put those in the Q&A or the chat feature, and Derek and I will get to them as we go through the conversation. With that, I'll turn it over to Derek to do a more full introduction and kick us off. Thanks.
All right, John, good morning. It is so great to have you here. You are so many things rolled into one here. We do a lot of these programs with CEOs that are leading new technologies. We do some of these with people that just have amazing stories and amazing backgrounds. And you have a great story as a patient. You have a great story as a leader. And you have a great story as a person. So good morning. It's great to have you here.
Good morning, Derek. It's great to be with you. Good morning, Jennifer. And thanks to Woodruff Sawyer for sponsoring this. Really appreciate it.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much to the team and Megan for helping us put all of this together. So I'm going to give you the floor in a second, but I'll just lay the groundwork a little bit here. So a lot of what you do has really been driven by your experience as a patient. And, we talk a lot about how we're bringing the patient more into the dialogue and into the conversation around how new things get developed. So why don't you give us a little bit of background on where you came from and how you got to where you are and your terrific story.
Sure. So I've spent 30 years as a healthcare executive in the diagnostic space. I grew up through the commercial ranks, started as a sales rep, through sales and marketing into general management, and ultimately to the role of CEO. And I've been CEO of 3 different companies, currently chairman and CEO of T2 Biosystems. In 2017, I was diagnosed with an acute life-threatening illness that led to a heart transplant, as well as a diagnosis and recovery from sepsis. And the story started, ironically, on Easter Sunday, April 16th, 2017. I had traveled to Aruba with my girlfriend for vacation, and within 12 hours of arriving on that beautiful island, I was found unconscious and unresponsive in the middle of the night. So there's no 911 to call in Aruba, as you can imagine, for anybody that's been there. But I was defibrillated, stabilized, and ultimately med-flighted to Baptist Hospital in Miami, Florida. And I had the privilege of speaking to the team that actually med-flighted me out of Aruba recently, and what a remarkable experience. I spent 10 days at Baptist Hospital in the intensive care unit, no diagnosis. Quite frankly, I felt pretty well enough to push them to let me leave wearing a life vest, and then ultimately ended up at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. I spent 55 days in the cardiac surgical intensive care unit, which is considered a rather lengthy stay in an ICU. I was in acute heart failure, and upon my arrival, there was no known cause. I was a perfectly healthy guy my entire life. I was a former college athlete. I train every day. I don't drink. I don't smoke. I don't use drugs. No family history. So this was out of left field, as people might consider it. I had 4 surgeries in my first 4 days at Mass General Hospital, serious surgeries. And on the 4th day, I got a diagnosis. And The diagnosis was grave. It is called giant cell myocarditis. For most of you in healthcare, you have probably never heard of it, like me. Most doctors, ironically, have never heard of it. It is a progressively fatal disorder that's been diagnosed about 300 times in medical history. It was first discovered in 1905. Almost all of those cases have been diagnosed at autopsy. So it's considered more or less an unsurvivable diagnosis. And one of the reasons is that it has a mean time from diagnosis to death of 4 to 5 months. So I was immediately in the fight of my life. I was also immediately placed on the heart transplant list and had my 4th surgery that same day. So as a CEO or as a healthcare executive, I mean, I'm used to getting large amounts of information thrown at me and trying to be as decisive as possible to drive to a good outcome. This was very different. I was getting thrown things at me that were serious, I mean, life-threatening serious. And one of those was a decision that I had to make on that 4th day. My life was at danger. I knew that I needed a heart transplant. Most heart transplantation patients wait on the waiting list for months, if not years. And I didn't have that kind of time. To complicate matters, I'm an O negative blood type, which makes me a universal organ donor, but it makes me a very tough organ recipient in that I can only receive an O negative organ. That's about 7 to 8% of the population. So odds were stacked against me. And in order to try to buy time, I was put on life support. And that's a tough discussion to receive as a patient. We're going to put you on life support. Having spent as much time as I have in healthcare, I knew the standard of care was to sedate patients into a medically induced coma. I also knew that 70% of the patients that are put on this type of life support don't survive. And so I asked what I thought was a pretty simple question. Seems a little bit weird, but can I stay awake when I'm on this life support system? Because I knew I was fighting for my life and I wasn't about to take a nap.
Right.
And so they, after trying to talk me out of it for a half a day, allowed me to stay awake on life support.
Okay.
They described it as being a horrific experience. And I would say when I woke up from that surgery, I knew exactly what horrific meant. On day 12, all my organs started to fail. That's one of the other complications of this life support system. I was taken off life support. My chest was cut open for the first time, where they cut through your chest, saw through your sternum, open your chest cavity, and they put in a pump in my left ventricle and also in my right, known as a bivad. That takes over the complete function of the heart. And then it's just a matter of praying and hoping that a donor heart comes in time to save your life. I battled a life-threatening clot. I battled hospital-acquired pneumonia. I mean, these are infections that you get when you're sick and critically ill in the hospital. Yeah. And ultimately, on July 8th of that same year, 2017, I received a life-saving heart transplant. And I'll just touch on one other thing that happened post-transplant, because this really becomes part of the story. Oftentimes for critically ill patients, and this occurs in transplant, it occurs in oncology, and then sometimes more broadly in the intensive care unit, patients that are vulnerable because they're immunocompromised, they've had serious surgery, or they're on chemotherapy, are very susceptible to hospital-acquired infections. And in my case, because I was critically ill, I was immunocompromised, and I had several major surgeries, I got several multi-drug resistant bacterial infections, one of which became septic. And so I got a crash course in broad spectrum antibiotic treatment, hospital-acquired infections, and the risk of sepsis. And I think maybe just to sort of bring this full circle, I told this story publicly for the first time in New York at an American Heart Association event in 2018. It was a fundraiser held on Long Island. I'd never told it publicly before that. I never planned to, quite frankly. But when I did, there were 300-400 people in the audience, almost in tears. And I realized this is something that I could use, so to speak, as a platform to raise awareness. And that really drove to writing a book titled Courage, Powerful Lessons in Leadership, Strength, and the Will to Succeed, which I wrote in honor of my heart donor. And we actually launched it on his birthday. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions from that.
No, that's great. I just put the book in. I just put a link to the book in the chat for everyone. You know, I got to read it over the weekend. It's really excellent, and I caught myself, you know, kind of smiling while you were telling your story a little bit, not because it's a funny story, but because the book actually goes into, you know, more of the detail and more of the conversations. And I was smiling at the conversation around, you know, can I stay awake? Where the reaction of the doctors was something along the lines of like, well, you know, medically you could, but like we don't do that for, you know, this litany of reasons. I would also throw in there that you glossed over the part that when they put you in the life vest and you flew back to Boston, you thought it would be a really good idea to stop in New York for the earnings meeting, uh, which is something that comes up later. But you know, until we really know the gravity of the situation that we're in, and if you feel fine, a lot of times you make these decisions where you're like, well, this is my job and this is what I'm supposed to do. And you know, a lot of times we don't necessarily, again, have all of the information that either our teams have or stuff that's going to keep us okay.
Well,
So
it can be both a blessing and a curse to be born without an off switch.
Yeah.
And I
yep,
clearly am one of those people. And I looked at it as I had made commitments to people. I had made commitments to our shareholders. I had made commitments to my colleagues. And I felt fine. And I was going to stop in New York and I was going to run our board meeting and our annual shareholder
yeah,
meeting and our earnings call. And I took a Q2 earnings call from my hospital bed because that's what we do.
Yeah.
yep,
I went back to the office in labor with my first because I needed to tie up I didn't want to inconvenience people by leaving things sort of hanging.
I love that. It's being
yeah,
all in.
yep, yep. So I think it's important to set a little bit of the stage here for the rest of the discussion. So you're now chairman and CEO of T2 Biosystems, which is actually a fantastic technology platform that we'll talk more about. But I think it would be useful to talk a little bit about the background on sepsis and why it's important. And, you know, again, I think this has been a challenge that's existed for a long time in the healthcare industry. Surely anybody that's ever kind of dipped a toe in these waters knows how hard it is, right? So, you know, just for you know, I tell you what, why don't I let you give the brief sepsis overview?
Sure. I actually knew nothing about sepsis when I entered the hospital. I knew little about hospital-acquired infections.
Yeah.
Probably like most people, I had heard of MRSA, but that really was the extent of it. It was really superficial and I'd say somewhat embarrassing considering I've been in healthcare as long as I've been. And when I was in the hospital and really kind of sitting in my hospital bed, trying to wrap my head around my survival is entirely dependent on someone else's loss. I mean, that's the most difficult thing, quite frankly, that I went through was psychologically getting my head around that. And I decided and I made a promise and a commitment that when I survived, and it was really a when, I was going to do something significant to pay it forward. At that time, I had no idea what that would be. And I didn't put a timeline on it, but I made a promise. And I remember saying to my cardiac surgeon when they wheeled me out of my room for the transplant, I said, Dr. D'Alessandro, I have no idea how I'm going to deliver on this promise, but I promise if you save my life, I'm going to make you proud. And he sort of chuckled and said, make me proud, don't make me proud. I'm going to save your life either way.
Yeah, like,
And
I laughed out loud when I read that in the book. That's classic surrogate. Yeah, sure, whatever, pal.
that's
Doesn't
confident.
matter.
That's confident. That's the guy I want operating on me. And when I got out of the hospital and I started sort of trying to put some of the pieces of my health journey together,
yeah,
really diving into my medical records, which are just pages and pages long, I just couldn't piece together this part of the hospital-acquired infections. And so I started reading about that at night. And the more I read, the more disturbing it was. I mean, it was almost going into Gacy's basement. Every door I opened, everything I read was more disturbing. And if you look at the data around sepsis, it's really alarming. And I think this is an area that more people are becoming aware of this, but the awareness is still not where it needs to be. Sepsis is the #1 cost of US hospitalization. According to US Health and Human Services, the annual cost is about $62 billion. Now, I've been at T2 about a little over 18 months. When I got here, that number, same estimate by Health and Human Services, was 27 billion. Then it went to 41 billion and now 62 billion. I suspect because of COVID and the fact that many of the COVID patients are actually dying of sepsis,
Right.
whether it's from respiratory virus or whether it's from bloodstream infection, and the data is clear about the link between COVID and sepsis, that number is much higher. And then the second statistic, which is equally staggering, is that sepsis is the #1 cause of death in US hospitals, claiming nearly 270,000 lives each and every year.
Wow.
So we've seen the human and economic toll related to COVID, that this is happening with sepsis each and every year. And the issue around detecting these sepsis causing pathogens is it's a race against time. And the data says that for each hour of delayed targeted treatment, mortality risk increases by up to 8%. So it doesn't take too many hours of delayed treatment for the patient to die.
Right.
And the current standard of care, which is really getting to the heart of the issue, continues to rely on a positive blood culture, which has two major issues. One, they are notoriously insensitive, having a sensitivity around 60%.
Yeah.
If that were a diagnostic product, it would never get approved by the Food and Drug Administration.
Yeah.
And the bigger issue is they typically take 1 to 5 days. And as I mentioned before, if mortality rate can increase by up to 8% for every hour, again, it doesn't take too many hours for that patient to expire.
Right.
And then the last
And also,
thing,
if you have, go ahead.
sorry, Derek, I was just going to say the last thing, which just puts a pin in it, is studies show that the empiric antibiotic protocols that are applied to patients that are considered to have a bloodstream infection are only optimal in about half of the cases. So it's a little better or a little worse than a coin toss, depending on which side of that equation you're on. That's the antithesis of precision medicine. It's not acceptable in 2021. And the way I describe it, if you look at the data, mortality rate and cost, it doesn't matter whether you're a patient, a payer, or a provider. The current standard of care is failing all of them.
Absolutely. And at this point, this is the point where everybody says, well, then we need a better system of detecting pathogens in the hospital, right? And this is where just about, countless number of businesses have failed trying to bring a rapid detection system into the hospital, whether it's at the bedside, whether it's whatever it is. Every single senior design competition has a group that tries to do, multi-pathogen PCR for bench to bedside applications for identifying the pathogen, because as you say, you're treating things blind, right? They go in with broad spectrum antibiotics because you might be septic, they don't know what it is, and now they have to wait around to see if they can find it. And if you have a slow growing pathogen, your blood cultures at 5 days, maybe they come back and maybe they don't. So we're literally operating in the dark, and it's been an area where it's been incredibly hard from a business sense to actually get a hospital to adopt any sort of rapid testing ideology. You know why that is?
Well, I think there are
Why is it so hard?
I think there are a number of factors. First, I think it's worth talking about the technology. And you're absolutely right. There are a number of outstanding companies. I mean, Roche and Abbott have entered into this field and failed, and many others along the way. And so from a technology standpoint, the critical goal that all of these companies have held is to try to detect these sepsis causing pathogens directly from blood, culture independent, because this idea of waiting for blood culture, I mean, blood culture was a great innovation in sepsis 50 years ago, but it's not today. And so being able to detect these pathogens directly from whole blood within a few hours is a major innovation. And T2 Biosystems is the only company that has technology cleared by the FDA and in commercial use able to do that. So massive innovation leap on the technology side. There's still a lot more to do in terms of expanding our detection capabilities, but major innovation from T2 Biosystems. And that's one of the things that drew me here, because I believe that technology innovation is critical to solving this sepsis crisis that is leading to massive antibiotic resistance the way we're treating patients with broad spectrum antibiotics. So I think that's the first part, is we need to have the technology in order to drive changes in standard of care. And the second part is, it's not simple to change a long-standing standard of care. However, it can be done. And two companies that I like to talk about here when we talk about successful companies in changing long-standing standards of care, one is Exact Science, is a well-known diagnostic company, and they were trying to change a standard of care from colonoscopy to a molecular diagnostic screening test for colorectal cancer. And I think their initial ambitions were to get rid of colonoscopy. And that's a major, bold step. And I think what they did was retreated to, let's run as an adjunctive test, and over time, we will take over many of the colonoscopies that are unnecessary. And they're still not very well penetrated, but building a substantial business and has a multi-billion-dollar market cap. The other is CareDx. It's a little more near and dear to my heart as a transplant patient, where rather than doing a tissue biopsy, which is the standard of care to look at rejection, is looking at molecular diagnostics, cell-free DNA to measure tissue or organ transplant rejection. I mean, yesterday morning, I started in the cath lab where I had, I think, my 29th right heart tissue biopsy. And again, this is a standard of care that is not so patient-friendly, but these standards of care, in order to change them, and I think we can tear a page out of the playbook for these companies, is certainly it took technology, and T2 Biosystems made a huge leap there, as I mentioned. It also takes education, educating the clinicians, educating the laboratory professional, educating the C-suite in these hospitals about these kinds of technology advances. It takes data, both clinical and economic data, because clinicians, they move based on data. It's not enough to tell a good story or have a good idea. You need to have clinical and economic data to support those products and that innovation. It takes, in some cases, changes in guidelines. If the current standard of care is embedded in all of the guidelines, then it takes effort to be included in those guidelines. And then the last thing I would say is, payers obviously drive a lot of the decisions within our healthcare system. And so having the appropriate, effective reimbursement or payment systems is another element. So think of these as sort of 5 legs of the stool: technology, education, guidelines, data, and reimbursement are all really critical elements of changing standard of care. And we're going after all of those.
And I guess you might also call data, another term would be success, right? Because you have to, when patients' lives are on the line, you have to show via the data you generate that the alternative can be more successful than the current standard of care.
That's exactly right, Jennifer. Real world data with real hospitals, in country, for example, key hospitals within the United States that are using the product, and that it's effectively deployed. And I'll share a couple of things with you about our product. I mean, a meta-analysis was completed looking at which looked at the data from 14 studies, and 7 in the United States, 7 internationally, and comparing our technology to the current blood culture-based standard of care, and the time to detection of pathogens using T2 versus blood culture, 77 hours faster.
Wow.
The reduction in length of stay in the hospital and ICU was between 4.5 and 5 days shorter using our product. So, I mean,
that's a lot.
That's real world data that shows
that's a lot
effect that our products can have within these hospital systems from an economic standpoint and from a patient care standpoint and a hospital length of stay standpoint.
Yeah, because you're able to identify the pathogen earlier in order to start the treatment.
Exactly, and get the patient on targeted antimicrobial therapy. Exactly right.
Yeah, we've talked a bunch here. We've had a number of guests talking about antimicrobial resistance. Certainly, we've talked a lot about infectious disease, given the experience with COVID over the past 18 months, which is really why we're here in the first place. This originally as a program was something we ran a few times a year with CEOs and early stage entrepreneurs, basically as a roundtable breakfast. And during when April rolled around, we switched it to this format. It's become much more general, and as you can imagine, so much of what we talked about has been talking about COVID and early detection. So there's a lot of lessons in sepsis, or there's a lot of lessons I believe that COVID has brought forward that hopefully can extend and get people to appreciate some of these things a little bit more. That data is incredible. Certainly, if you're talking about more than 3 days in a reduction of stay, and basically even if you take out the parts about contributing to antibiotic resistance, it's huge. So how did you get to T2 in the first place?
So I sought the company out. As I mentioned before, I had made a commitment to do something significant to pay it forward. And when I did my research on sepsis, it was clear to me that T2 had the only technology that could really penetrate these markets in a culture independent way. And so I joined in January of 2020, just before the COVID pandemic hit, which is impeccable timing. But the fact of the matter is, the COVID pandemic has also increased both the awareness and the risks associated with sepsis. So the issue of sepsis has not been tamped down because of COVID. It's actually, the awareness has been heightened. So,
yep.
Yeah.
I think if anything, the people now know what a cytokine storm is. People know what happens when your body gets too many immune switches thrown at once. So what was the company like when you stepped in? As a little bit of background, I remember talking to Amir Nashad at Polaris, who was one of the people that funded the company initially, and who had glowing things to say about the team and the execution. And this was after it took, I think, about 7 years or so to get to IPO. And Amir's comment was essentially that I would love to tell you that there were a lot of mistakes and a lot of things along the way that they had to pivot. And he goes, they didn't. He goes, it's just an exceptionally hard market to penetrate. He goes, the team was really exceptional in the way they executed. So I imagine you stepped into a company with probably a really, really good team around it. It has an excellent technology, and a market that is just kind of like pulling a rough horse to water. So what was it like to step into that?
Well, it's exciting when you have the opportunity to affect millions of lives around the world each and every year. That's an exciting and huge opportunity. The fact that I'm leading this company and I'm a sepsis survivor really, I would say, adds a heightened sense of urgency to everything we do, because I wake up every morning thinking about how we can positively impact the lives of those 270,000 patients that are potentially at risk of death due to sepsis in the United States, and 11 million worldwide each and every year. So I'd say on the first level, it's really exciting. When you look at our mission, it's to fundamentally change the way medicine is practiced. And that really speaks to the heart of this whole broad spectrum antibiotic area through transformative diagnostics, which is what we really have in our hands, that improve the lives of patients around the world. So we think about that mission in those really 3 areas: fundamental change, transformative diagnostics, and the focus on the patient. When you look at the history of the company, as I said before, massive innovation on the technology side, the only company that can do what we do today, the only company that has products cleared by the FDA. When you look at the commercial success, I think some people would say it's not fast enough. And I'm clearly in that camp. I want us to move faster because I want us to impact patients' lives quicker. It's difficult to do what we're doing. We are steadfast in our mission, despite the COVID pandemic and the fact that lots of companies got distracted during that. We stayed laser focused on our mission, laser focused on sepsis. While we launched a COVID molecular diagnostic test, it was really because we felt it would advance our mission in sepsis. And at the same time, we could help hospital laboratories, microbiology labs, which are our customers in sepsis, solve a critical pain point that they have in lack of supply of high quality molecular diagnostic tests. So it's been a catalyst for us to advance our sepsis initiative. In terms of the company overall, we've made lots of changes. I mean, the first thing that small companies have to do, and companies in general, is stay very focused. So we're focused on 3 corporate priorities. It's accelerating our sales, enhancing our operations, think of those as internal investments that we're making to scale the company, and advancing our product pipeline, which is our future, obviously. So staying really focused on those key objectives is critical. We made some leadership changes in the company. We made changes in our board to add one, diversity, and not just gender diversity or ethnic diversity, which we expanded both, but also experience diversity in adding both clinical and commercial expertise to our board. We added a hospital system CEO. We added a person that used to run the molecular diagnostics business for Roche, who now leads one of the largest health life science search firms. She was the founder. And then we added the CEO of a major molecular diagnostic company. So we think we got the right experience and diversity on our board. We've added diversity to our leadership team, and we've invested heavily both in commercialization and in clinical and medical affairs. Again, to drive some of those, what we called legs of the stool earlier, which will help us drive adoption and drive utilization of our tests in the market.
Let me ask you this: when you're looking and you're thinking about a sea change, right, in the way society addresses, right, this from a healthcare standpoint, and the apple is so big, how do you decide what's the most important piece to start with when you've got all of those 5 legs of your, it's actually more like a table, that need to be addressed? How do you decide what comes first?
Well, sometimes you have to address more than one simultaneously. So I think the idea of, we have to do 5 things and it has to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is probably not reasonable. In our case, we are very strong on the technology side, and we're very fortunate that the US government continues to support us. The pre-COVID, we had the largest grant ever given to a diagnostic company from BARDA. And that is to develop our resistance panel, which runs on our current instrument, multi-target biothreat panel, which runs on our current instrument,
right,
and then a next generation instrument. And really, I think what's considered the holy grail of dealing with sepsis diagnostics is a comprehensive sepsis panel that combines bacterial detection, fungal detection, and resistance markers in one test. And we're making outstanding progress on that. But that's the future. And what we have to focus on today, and I talk about this in the book, and I think it applies to life, to business, to sports, whatever you're doing, is to focus on the intersection between the things that matter and the things that you can control. And oftentimes, especially in a crisis or in a pandemic, people get distracted by all of the things that are coming at them, and they lose focus on the intersection of those two circles. And for us, staying very focused on our technology, staying very focused on the internal operations of our company, and staying very focused on driving sales, which means adoption and utilization of our test, that will save lives, that will create shareholder value. And so we focus on those things. I mean, when it comes to my personal story, I mean, I was fighting for my life, and having never spent a day in a hospital, and being a person who likes to control the things that I can control and focus on, there was a lot of things I had no control over, and I just had to lay down and trust people. But I had to stay extremely focused on the things that I could control, which was I could do things to fight for my life that the hospital couldn't do for me, which is I could bring my attitude every day. And when the nurses walked into my room and said, "How are you doing today, Mr. Sperzel?" And I said, "Awesome." I mean, I could see them step back because I'm laying on my back, I'm on life support, I have 20 things coming out of my body, and I'm saying awesome, and they're thinking, what is wrong with this guy?
They're like, did we give him the wrong medicine this morning?
Well, there's a psychology.
How are you doing? Awesome. Well, no, you're not, but all right, we're gonna go anyway.
Right, and there's a psychology to it too. I mean, humans are humans, and if they see that I'm willing to lay it on the line like that, they're going to work just as hard or maybe harder to save my life. And the same applies to business and life in general.
Which is partly why I suspect you refused to be put into a coma when they had you on life support.
Well, that was one of the things that I could control. And again, they didn't want me to do that. They tried to talk me out of it, and I understand why now, having gone through it. It is physically very difficult. And it is psychologically overwhelming. But from my perspective, the window was going to be narrow either way. I'm going to go through a very tough gauntlet, and I'm going to survive, or I'm going to try to go through a very tough gauntlet and I'm not. But either way, I'm going to control the outcome because that's something that I can control.
Yeah.
And I always think, pain is temporary, and every mother in the world knows that.
Yeah. So in terms of things you can and can't control, it's interesting to think about this. When you think about turnaround time, your turnaround time is not really instrument turnaround time, right? It's the time from when somebody takes a sample to whenever the doctor actually gets the information on the other end. So the only time that you really control is, the time in the box, right? How fast does the measurement get taken? How hard is it to talk to hospitals about the way that they run their procedures, about the way that they actually handle their workflows, right? Because I imagine there is a lot of please don't tell us how to run our hospital in those discussions.
Well, that's an area that we don't really drive. I mean, again, that's not something that we can control a hospital's workflow. We have to think about how our systems fit into their workflow.
Yeah.
What I can tell you is hospital laboratories are incredibly efficient. I think a lot of the inefficiency that did exist in hospital labs doesn't exist today. And I think that's a fantastic thing for patients. When it comes to patients at risk of sepsis or suspected of sepsis, there's obviously a heightened sense of urgency for those patients, whether a hospital is using the current blood culture-based standard of care or whether they have adopted T2's technology. I mean, those blood samples move to the laboratory and that information gets back to the clinician very quickly. And so that's not something we worry about. What we try to focus on is let's take out as much of the time as we possibly can by adding our technology as an adjunctive test and get clinicians answers quicker.
Yeah.
So
let me ask you. Go ahead, Jennifer.
So in a case where they are using the T2, are they also still sending out blood for culture?
They are. They absolutely are. And I think that will continue to be the case. It will be, we believe, utilized less, blood culture that is, once we have a more comprehensive sepsis panel.
Yes. Okay. That makes sense.
So let me ask you this. Why hasn't sequencing been put in a more, kind of robust or more complete fashion here? Right? Why did genomic sequencing not necessarily catch on in these areas? Is it too much from an infrastructure cost? Has it classically been too slow? What are some of the big barriers for why that didn't work?
I'm not sure, Derek. That's a very good question. Not entirely sure the answer to that.
Yeah, I also imagine from a commercial sense, it's not exactly something that you would start to advocate for. So why don't we talk a little bit more about what you've done from the COVID perspective, because it obviously has applications well outside the hospital, right? How have you thought from a business sense about really your customer focus in terms of dealing primarily with hospitals and potentially the grounds that you could cover in an ex-hospital environment?
Sure. So we only sell into hospitals. So I think that's the first thing to say. And when people think about COVID diagnostic testing, they maybe think about their own experience, whether they have gone to a walk-in clinic or a retail pharmacy, or maybe they've been an inpatient in a hospital. And so because our focus is sepsis, and because, as I said before, we really stayed true to our mission, we didn't step outside the hospital market. I mean, we exist as a company. And I think that's something that companies always have to think about, which is, why do you exist? Why are you differentiated? Is it sustainable? And for us, the answers to those questions always lead to sepsis. That's where we offer major advantage versus anything else. There are lots of diagnostic tests for COVID that are excellent diagnostic tests, and they serve all different types of market segments. For us, what we wanted to do was, as I said before, help hospital laboratories, and in our case, microbiology labs, because that's where most of this testing is done, solve an issue that they had early in the pandemic. And so in, I think, late March of 2020, we made the decision to develop and commercialize a COVID diagnostic test. We licensed some technology from a hospital health system, Hackensack in New Jersey, and we applied that to our platform. And in pretty much record time, we got that product to market like many other diagnostic companies,
Yeah.
and began commercializing it. And while we had a lot of interest from a lot of different places, and I personally had conversations with many professional sports organizations about their diagnostic testing for COVID, at the end of the day, for us, it only made sense to sell our instrument into hospital microbiology labs.
Yep.
And even to go a step further, to qualify those accounts to make sure that they were target accounts for us for sepsis, so that that investment that we made and the investment that they were making in our instrument made sense for the long term. And that we had the
Yep.
potential to,
Right.
once the pandemic was under control, or once that hospital system no longer needed our platform for COVID testing, that there was an interest in moving to sepsis testing. That would align with our interests, that would align with their
Yep.
interests. And so we were very strict about where we sold our instrument, why we sold it to a particular account. And our goal remains long-term to convert 100% of those to sepsis testing.
What
Yeah.
are you seeing across the country as far as, are hospitals still needing your technology for COVID testing? Obviously, I know COVID has played out very differently at different times across all of the regions, right?
Yes. So we sold about 47 instruments in the back half of 2020 for COVID testing.
Yeah.
And across the board, our COVID customers continue to use our COVID test.
Yeah.
Mhm. So we think a lot about the interplay between kind of patient advocacy groups and innovation and really how things break into the marketplace. Can you talk a little bit about how sepsis is discussed, talked about? Are there any groups that you work closely with, or are people that you think do really exceptional work in this area to bring a lot of these issues to the forefront and really educate people about them?
Absolutely. I think it's a really great point. The Sepsis Alliance is the nation's leading organization that's focused on sepsis. And we are in Sepsis Awareness Month. Sepsis Alliance just had the 2021 Sepsis Summit. We were the primary sponsor of that. So that is the best organization for people to go to get information about sepsis. And quite frankly, we're very pleased to be working with them. I am an advisor to their board, which again, this is, if we're going to be in this space, we have to get involved. We have to take action outside of our normal day-to-day jobs. I mean, that's one thing that I talk to people about all the time is get involved, and don't just talk about it, like take action. So I got involved with Sepsis Alliance. Our company has gotten significantly involved with Sepsis Alliance. I spent an hour on the phone with another board member who, I mean, is a remarkable person, Katie Granger, got a blister on her thumb. It became septic. She lost both of her feet and she lost 7 of her fingertips. And I mean, you want to talk about a person with an attitude. She gets me fired up when I talk to her. And I mean, just think about it. Lost 7 of her fingertips. And she will say, I don't think about the fact that I lost 7 fingertips. I think about the fact that I still have my hands. I mean, that's an attitude that I think 90% of people would not have. And when you talk to people like that, it's very easy to get inspired, and it's very easy to get excited about the things that we can have, that we have at T2 that can positively affect outcomes for patients. I mean, in addition to the 270,000 deaths, which I think is undercalled, there are about 18,000 amputations each year as a result of sepsis. I was almost one of those patients. I don't have any nerve feeling from my knees down in both legs. Both of my legs turned black at one point. They were both at risk of amputation.
Yeah.
I had to spend a month in a rehab facility after my heart transplant to learn how to walk again without the feeling in my lower legs. So, I mean, I know firsthand how quickly sepsis can go to severe sepsis and amputation and death. And I mean, that gets me motivated every single day to do something to affect outcomes for these patients.
And we found,
So-
obviously, that working with patient advocacy groups, when you do need change on the policy side, and even the payer side as well, like they can be so impactful by telling their stories and how they were impacted, in this case by sepsis, it would, in order to make policymakers and lawmakers understand the real impact on patients.
Absolutely right. I mean, this is the thing about sepsis. If you think about other infectious disease, so take malaria, which a lot of it happens in sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of policymakers in the United States will say, well, I'm never going to go there. Malaria is never going to affect me. It's never going to affect my family members. So why do I care? Right? I mean, there are people in that camp. I don't think that that's correct, but there are people in that camp. There are people in the camp around policies for sexually transmitted infectious disease, which some would view as, well, there's a certain risk element that goes into somebody getting a sexually transmitted disease. And if I'm not in that group, why do I care about it? Again, I don't think that's right, but there are people in that camp. Sepsis can affect everyone. Again, I was a perfectly healthy person outside of getting this very, very rare diagnosis, and no pre-existing conditions, no comorbidities, no other health issues. And I was in one of the best hospitals in the world. And
I was just going to say, you were in a top 5 medical institution. This was you were not in an understaffed, under-resourced medical environment. You were literally in one of the best places in the world.
It can, I mean, my older son was immune compromised as a child, and he had been in the hospital. He was about 15 months old, came home. His grandmother was in the hospital. We went to visit her for 30 minutes. He picked up MRSA, like just by, because he was immune compromised. And so that was all it took, was a 30-minute visit to grandmother to have some, and luckily it didn't progress. We were able to treat it and get the right antibiotic eventually. But yeah, I mean, it like you said, it can happen to anybody and quickly.
And so think about this. Imagine a patient goes into an ICU room in a hospital wing, and they have MRSA, and it's not detected fast enough. And a nurse goes from room to room to room to room to other critically ill patients. I mean, again, it doesn't matter, big hospital, small hospital, urban, rural, top 10, bottom 10, sepsis is affecting all of these hospitals. And we have the data that looks at, under the DRG system, the Medicare reimbursement under these sepsis codes, and hospitals across the country are way underwater with their sepsis patients because these patients stay in the hospital a long time,
for so long, right?
Critically ill, and I mean, it goes downhill very, very quickly. So detecting these pathogens quickly is the key to better outcomes, lower risk of death, and obviously cost savings for the payers.
Right, and that's even before we get to things like antibiotic resistance, right? Because not only are we replacing the slower detection technology, we're hopefully going to replace the need to basically just hit people with a broad spectrum antibiotic and hope that we get the right one, right? I mean, that's really kind of one of the big underlying risks here, is that because we haven't implemented these tools, we're using antibiotics in a way that honestly they shouldn't be used, and is leading to even more resistance. So, by not implementing these things fast enough, we're actually making the problem worse in many ways.
Well, antibiotic resistance is one of the greatest human health threats. I mean, the good news is our government knows this, and our government is investing in this area. And I think that's one of the reasons that our government decided to invest in T2 with this up to $69 million in funding to advance our next generation products. Because having products that can help address antibiotic resistance is critical for all of our futures.
Yep. So we do tend to talk about the future here at the end of our discussion, right? This terrific segue. So where do you see? So I'll ask this: where do you see things going, both from a hospital standpoint and just from a general healthcare standpoint? How does the future look different? Do you see a place where we actually have technologies like T2? Embedded in just about everything that we do? Do you think that this is surmountable in many ways? And if it is, what does that look like?
Well, I would say, just to touch on the T2 part first, one of the first questions I asked my predecessor is, why isn't the T2 platform in every single hospital around the world? Because had it been in my hospital, I had Pseudomonas aeruginosa. It's on our bacterial panel. It could have been detected within 3 to 5 hours. And unfortunately, I had a good outcome, but I could have been on the other side of that coin where I didn't have a good outcome.
Yeah, statistics are not kind there.
Yes, so that's our aim. That's our aim, no doubt about it. When I think about the future of diagnostic testing, I think the first thing that I would say is the human and economic toll related to COVID has been devastating. That's clear. And it's impacted every aspect of business and society. If we're looking for a silver lining, one of the silver linings, I believe, is that COVID has put diagnostics testing center stage.
Yeah.
People talk about diagnostic testing at their dinner tables that didn't know anything about it a year and a half ago. And I think that that's a good thing, because history says that diagnostic testing is a very small percentage of our healthcare spend. However, it's a very, very important part of it, because we need to know the status of the patient before we treat them. It's a really simple concept. Everyone should get it, but it's kind of taken a backseat to drugs. It's taken a backseat to antibiotics. And it actually should be in the front seat. It should be the first thing we do before we decide to treat patients. And I think COVID has really highlighted that and put diagnostic testing center stage. And I think that that is going to be one of the good outcomes that comes out of this pandemic, is the importance of diagnostics, the importance of understanding before we treat. And sepsis is one of the best examples I can think of, where we just start treating patients before we know what's wrong with them. And sometimes that's the best technology that we have. And that obviously has been the case for a long time with patients at risk of sepsis, but we can do better now. We can implement new technologies like T2s in conjunction with blood culture. So we're not threatening blood culture standard of care, but we can provide additional tools to clinicians so they can make better decisions, get patients on targeted therapy. And this is really what the future of diagnostics is it's targeted therapy, it's precision medicine. And I think, again, that's one of the good things that's coming out of this pandemic.
I would agree. It's the value of knowing which therapy to give earlier, right? And that's incredibly valuable. It actually changes a lot of times the way that we think about treatment. If you could do things earlier, what kind of things would you do? And this goes well beyond infectious disease. It goes to cancer. It goes to just about anything else. The value of early information is very, very high. And one of the things that I hope is a lasting lesson from COVID is that we take that value a little bit more seriously. We've seen really pretty massive data sharing efforts here, and implementing those on a micro scale to get patients like you were that information faster and faster, I think is going to save a lot of lives.
Agree.
So why don't we end on a bit of the personal here, and I'll kind of give you a little bit of the floor to talk about I guess some of the big things that you took away from your process, and kind of how it impacted the way that you think about things every day. You said you wanted to pay it forward. You said you wanted to do things that were meaningful. Why don't we talk about that a little bit? Because obviously you're driven to make this happen now, and I think there are probably other people, whether they're patients or anyone else, that can really kind of think about ways to focus themselves and think about things that'll motivate them.
Sure. I think the first thing I would say is that I didn't mention about the book is that I'm donating 100% of the proceeds to Donate Life America and Sepsis Alliance. And I would encourage people to go to the websites of each of those respective organizations and just spend 15 minutes with each one and educate yourself a little bit about the importance of organ donation and understand the factors around sepsis. And there's an acronym in terms of sepsis awareness called TIME, T-I-M-E. It's temperature, it is illness or infection, it is mental decline, and extremely ill. So I mean, these are the signs of sepsis. So educate yourself around those signs for sepsis. When I think about what I can take away from this journey, two words that always come to mind when people ask me, how are you different having gone through this? And those are perspective and urgency. And obviously I dealt with extreme adversity. I was in a life-threatening situation, and hopefully people don't find themselves dealing with that kind of adversity. And that alone can give you perspective. But the key is really to apply it How
Yeah.
am I going to take this experience and apply it to my life, or apply it to, in my case, pay it forward to others? I mean, the first thing I would say is I don't really get rattled by anything. I mean, I've had somebody stand there and say, your chances of survival are not 0, but they're not 5%. I mean, I've heard those words,
Yeah.
and I knew what that meant. And so there's a certain perspective that comes from that. And I hope nobody else has to deal with that kind of adversity, but we all deal with adversity at some level. We're all dealing with it with this pandemic. And the key is to take something away from that and apply it to your life. When it comes to urgency, I've always operated my life with a sense of urgency. I mentioned before not having an off switch, and that being a blessing and a curse. I think it's more of a blessing than a curse, but maybe
Depends on who you ask around you.
Yeah.
Exactly. If I asked my girlfriend, she'd say, well, yeah, you're tough to be around. I would say it's different now. It's very different because I would say it's more outward. I'm now focused on urgency around patients, other people that are at risk of sepsis. So it's more of call it a servant mindset that now I'm applying that urgency to try to help others. And I'm the luckiest guy on the planet because I survived something that is generally unsurvivable. Right. And I say this all the time, that giant cell myocarditis, a heart transplant, sepsis, it didn't happen to me, it happened for me. And I mean that, in that it gave me purpose.
Yeah.
I love what I do. I've always loved this space. I've always loved the idea of advancing life-saving technologies. And I've always put every ounce of energy I have between every company or every job that I've been in.
Yeah.
But it's different now.
Yeah.
Because it's not just purposeful, it's really what I would call true purpose. Like, I'm a sepsis survivor. I understand what it's like to be laying in a hospital bed, fighting for your life and waiting for results.
Yes.
Because I was aware of this. I mean, I knew I had an infection, and I would ask the clinicians every time, okay, what's going on? Do we have the results? I didn't know anything about T2 at that time.
Yeah,
I just thought this was all, you just wait for the blood culture.
Yeah.
And I was on 3 rounds of broad spectrum antibiotics before we finally got it right. I was actually discharged from the rehab facility and then readmitted to the hospital that same day. My temperature spiked again. So I have a perspective as a patient, and I have urgency for those patients. That's what's really different.
Yep.
Yeah. This story has your personal story is amazing. And I love the way that you're turning it in to really helping patients, right? To raise awareness, to put the tools in the hands of the hospitals to make it better, right? So it's really amazing. So thank you for sharing your story and your vision for T2 with us. I know that our guests have gotten a lot out of it, and those who find it on YouTube will continue to gain information and respect for what you're doing. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you for having me, and Derek, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And thanks
John,
again.
we really appreciate it. Thank you for your time today.
Okay, thank you.
Have a good one and be well.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.